Good evening and welcome to class 98. We've got 11 more classes to go. This class is on the most recent of my books. There are more classes on other books I've written, but they are mostly dealing with poetry that either I wrote or that I translated or co-translated from Tahire's poetry. We've got actually 4 books of Tahire's poetry now, and we'll won't discuss them in great depth, but what we will do with the poetry discussions is sample some of the more understandable poems, that is understandable on a first hearing. Poetry by necessity, because it is veiled in metaphor and imagery, almost always requires in-depth study, a close reading, and a lot of times footnotes and so on. So I already have arranged these classes, and I have picked out poems that I think you would enjoy and hopefully understand upon looking at them at a first glance. We will then end with a class on a book that I am currently writing. There's one book of mine that has that is contracted to come out this year, the 4th book on the poems of Tahirih, called Sparks of Fire. So we will go over some of the poems from that. And then the book I'm working on now is called The Mind of God and the Structure of Reality. And we will discuss the ideas behind that book, even though I don't know when it will be completed, if it will be completed, or if it'll be any good when it is completed. But it's an idea I've had in mind for a long time. It's simply the idea that if we understand the purpose of God in creating reality, then everything else makes sense. That is, the structure of how he has gone about creating reality becomes understandable, or at least in my mind it does. I'm not sure that's true for everybody, and I'm not sure the scientists will agree with what I have to say, but it has to do with the harmony of science and religion. Tonight we're going over the most recent book of mine to come out, which is the Body of God, a reader's guide to Baha'u'llah's Súrih Hekel, one of the more abstruse and complicated of Baha'u'llah's works. And the fact that it was one of the reasons that I felt not obliged, but challenged and desirous of looking into it to see if I could figure out what it meant, at least for me. Again, as all of you probably know, there is no authoritative translation or interpretation, I should say, of the Baha'i writings, except by the Guardian and Abu Baha, and of course Baha'u'llah himself. So we are all urged to study the writings for ourselves and come up with our own ideas about them and share those ideas. And of course, because as Baha'u'llah says, that there are many levels of meaning to his writings and to all scripture, the idea that we could encompass it is obviously absurd. So the book does not pretend to examine or interpret or get at every point, but just the overall sense of what Baha'u'llah is trying to do with this work. So let me share my screen and go to the slides for this evening. The Body of God, a reader's guide to Baha'u'llah's Surah of the Temple. The book was published in this fall. It's 312 pages, and there are 3 places that you can obtain it: from the Association for Baha'i Studies site, the Baha'i Distribution Center or bookstore site, and then from Amazon. and it's available from all three of those in ebook or Kindle. This is my idea. Sometimes I will go ahead and make a cover just to inspire me when I'm working on something, so I can pretend like it's already done, and then I will start with an outline, so on. Depends on the work, but this is what I envision the possibility for the book I'm working on now. So what are the major observations and conclusions that I tried to examine and draw from my study of the Súrih Hekel? As it says here, and as I've already mentioned, one inspiration was the Guardian's praise of the work. Another was the historical importance of the work, both at the time Baha'u'llah revealed this work and included in the revised version of it the letters to 5 of the rulers of his day. Also because it is in this work that he says that you have neglected or foregone the possibility of attaining the most great peace. Now achieve the lesser peace if you can. And that was in the letter to Queen Victoria. And the importance of it to contemporary history is particularly important, because the same admonitions that he gives and advice he gives to the rulers of that day are as applicable to us in our present day situation and to the rulers that currently hold the destiny of humankind in their hands. I began with outlining the book. That is, there are various methods I use for writing depending on the subject. The subject usually dictates the methodology I use in approaching a book. This book, because it was challenging, I decided that the best thing for me to do was to first outline it. Now, some works just, you can't do that or do it well. The Kitabi Agdas is one that I've mentioned before. It just defies being outlined, which is why the Guardian said that before it could be appropriately translated, there would need to be effectively an outline, which he called the codification and synopsis. So the codification and synopsis of the Agdas, which is at the front of the book, of course, it came out separately in 73, and then it was included in the present version of the work, which contains about 5 different components, including the Agdas, the notes, questions and answers, and so on. The outline took me 9 months, and that was working almost daily, because it was very complex in trying to grasp exactly not only what Baha'u'llah was saying, but the methodology he was using. And it helped me a great deal. And so I decided it was worthwhile to include that outline in the book. And so an appendix to the book contains the totality of that outline. The major symbols was another thing that I recognized right away. And of course, the work itself is based on the principal symbol of the temple. And the temple has a multiplicity of meanings. Excuse me, someone is not muted, and I'm hearing some clunking around somewhere. So if you're not muted, please mute yourself. The major symbol, of course, is the temple itself. And the temple at the first level of meaning is representative of the human body, as we will see. At the secondary level of meaning, it represents the manifestation of God, and indeed the creation of this intermediary is what takes place symbolically with the conversation between the Maiden of Heaven and Baha'u'llah as he is situated in the Siyachal, in the first declaration or first intimation of his revelation in 1853, actually the end of 1853, the beginning of 1854. It's during that period. And so this helped me a lot too, because this meaning the outlining, because I realized that framing the whole work is the discourse between the Maiden of Heaven, whom he sees in a dream vision, and Baha'u'llah as a persona in the work. Now, of course, as with the Tablet of the Holy Mariner, Baha'u'llah uses these creative methodologies, well aware that they are to be understood as symbolic and as metaphorical. So it's not really an actual maiden appearing in the Siyachal talking to Baha'u'llah and telling him what to do. Obviously, as Tahirzadeh in his 4-volume work, he discusses this work, and he says it's very interesting that what you have here is a discussion going on between one aspect of Baha'u'llah and another, and you could look at it as the human persona of Baha'u'llah conversing with the Holy Spirit within him. It's also, as I discuss in the slides later, it is the same sort of process that takes place, as Abdul Baha describes it, when we are in a state of meditation, where our rational self is holding converse with our spirit. And in this converse, the spirit informs the mind. And so that's the overall framework. But getting back to the symbol of the temple, so you have the temple as a human body, the temple as the body or station of, you remember you have the two stations of the prophet, the station of essential unity and the station of distinction. So the station of distinction is the fact that the manifestation appears at a certain time in human history with a certain persona, a persona in this case meaning a certain human personage who has certain circumstances. The Bab was a merchant. Baha'u'llah was the son of a well-respected nobleman, and so on. And then another level of the temple is the body of God. And that is, by that I don't mean literally, but in the sense that God is the creator, and God creates that we might know him, and everything he creates is a pathway to knowledge of God. And consequently, the appearance of God, as much as we can know him in the form of a human persona of the manifestation, leads us to an even more wider understanding of the totality of creation as a classroom, something we've mentioned throughout our classes, whereby we can get to know God by means of studying creation, how it is structured, and so on. So this is the shape in which Baha'u'llah had the work calligraphy drawn. As I recall, the calligraphy, now this is a Hekel transcribed or written in the calligraphy by the Bab. And it's hard for you to see it, but if you go in close on this, you can see that all of that is constructed of writing, and it's a tablet by the Bab. Well, this is the same thing Baha'u'llah had done. And I say he had done because, remember, he was poisoned by Mirza Yahya. And after that, his hand would shake for the rest of his life. And you can see, if you visit the Holy Land, the difference in his not eloquent, but exquisite calligraphy prior to that poisoning, and how the shaking lines of his calligraphy afterward. And so he had this done. And it consisted, as I said, of the original Súrih Hekel, which was revealed in Adrianople, together with 5 letters to 5 different rulers. And as I've said before, and I'm not sure this is this is a total guess on my part, possibly the Súrih Hekel would be at the center of this, and each of these points would represent or contain the letters to the 5 rulers. Don't know that that's true, just a total guess on my part. And this is an ancient drawing from 1533. I say ancient, that's AD or current era. But you can see how the Hekel is, or 5-pointed star, why it represents the human body, because you've got the head, the arms, the legs. You'll also notice, of course, something we've discussed many times before, the ringstone symbol, which contains 2 Hekels, one here on the left, which represents the Bab, and the one on the right represents Baha'u'llah. And this symbolism, which is a calligraphic symbol created by Abdu'l-Baha, contains 2 letters, the B and then the H on the end, BH, with the A understood. So the whole thing represents the greatest name, Baha. And the arrangement represents the transmission from the realm of the divine to the realm of command, to the realm of humankind, via the Holy Spirit, which descends through these realms and connects them. And in the middle, therefore, at this level of command, are the manifestations who enable that transmission of the divine message to humankind. Chapter 1 is an examination of some of the tools necessary for a study of the Súrih Hekel, and I discuss in that a number of fundamental constituent parts that constitute the Baha'i lens, as I call it throughout the work, through which we examine this work. And that is, when you one of the things that I found in translating, or attempting to translate the works of Thackeray in particular, is that to have a valid translation, particularly from a very distinctly different language and culture to another language and culture, you have to know the intended meaning of the work. That is, you have to know ahead of time what the author is getting at, or else you're just sort of flying blind. You may be able to translate sentences, but you will not give them a proper meaning if you don't know what the author is getting at. And so what I do in this chapter is construct the Baha'i lens. What is it that Baha'is assume before they even look at this work? What do they understand to be a Baha'i point of view? And of course, among these are the fact that history is a spiritual dynamic. The very first class in this series of classes is about how history is driven by religion, or by the appearance of the manifestations. That physical reality is a rational construct whereby God educates us, but we need the educators, and we need their advancing wineskins, which would be the administrative orders. So as we've said before, we realize as Baha'is that each manifestation brings these 2 distinctly different kinds of information: the spiritual teachings, which are reiterated and expanded, and some form of translating or transferring that information into social and personal and social action. And so you have then necessarily, because the manifestations themselves do not, excuse me, I went forward here, do not assume well, and in the case of Muhammad, that's not quite true, but do not normally assume secular authority. as Christ says, leave unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God's. Well, in one sense, that means that you pay your taxes and you become a dutiful citizen, but you owe your ultimate allegiance to God. And so you distinguish between the authority of the secular body politic and the authority of the manifestation who confers that authority upon them. And so one important theme throughout this is the fact that the manifestation, Baha'u'llah, is being told what to tell humankind, and in particular, what to tell these 5 representative kings and rulers, some of whom are secular, some of whom are religious. And so you have this delegation of authority from God to the manifestation through the Holy Spirit, and from the manifestation to the kings and rulers of the earth. And then ultimately, from the kings and rulers to the common man, to each of us, and what our duty is. So right now we have the House of Justice setting forth a 9-year plan for us to implement at the grassroots level. So, and then I also mentioned the different declarations, which we've mentioned before, the Sia Chal, and then the second declaration in the most holy festival, which we're celebrating now, the festival of Rizvan, and the 3 holy days contained therein. The third declaration would be the declaration to the kings and rulers. And then the fourth declaration, which is his very blatant statement to Mirza Yahya that he must recognize him or he will be, in effect, declared a covenant breaker. One thing that I found very interesting in going through this work and trying to understand it is I had been under the impression that the foregoing, or not foregoing is not the right word, but the loss of the access to the most great peace came about because the kings and rulers did not follow his advice to create a pact among themselves, which would be the beginnings of the foundations for a global commonwealth. What I realized in this work, which he makes very clear, is that particularly, as I say, in the letter to Queen Victoria, but also to the others as well, to Napoleon III, to the Pope Pius, and so on, is that in addition to agreeing to form this pact and abide by it and set up a system of collective justice, Baha'u'llah states that they must recognize him. So this is why, even though he is still urging them to achieve the lesser peace by constructing this pact, they've lost the most great peace because they have explicitly, in most cases, and implicitly with Queen Victoria, not recognized what he says very clearly in each of these 5 letters, that he is the most recent messenger from God, to the Pope that he is the second coming of Christ, and so on. So their failure to recognize his station is what really deprives them, and of course the whole of humankind on this planet, of the immediate attainment of the most great peace. It will still be attained, but only after going through the tribulations of the lesser peace and all that we must go through in the formative age, which we are currently in. The chapter 3, I talk about some of the other key symbols. The pentacle I've already mentioned. The allegory, as I said, and this is an allegorical work, of a dialogue between Baha'u'llah and the Maid of Heaven, Maiden of Heaven. And you have the construction by the maiden of the literal edifice that is the body of the prophet, and the symbolic edifice, which is the spiritual body. And so she speaks to the eyes of the temple, the feet of the temple, and so on, and tells each of the parts of this symbolic edifice what powers and attributes they must have in order to withstand and endure all that they will be called upon to undertake. Chapter 4, the construction and preparation of the temple, and this is where she talks to each of the components of the temple: the eyes, the ears, the tongue, the feet, the breast, and the inmost heart. And the inmost heart is tantamount in some ways to the soul of the temple. I believe it's in Persian is fuad. In chapter 5, the maid, each time, and again, this is an assumption on my part, but you'll notice that in many works, you have at the beginning of a passage, say, and then a semicolon, and then we have a passage. Does that mean we are supposed to say it, or is it the Holy Spirit telling the manifestation what to say, and so on? In this work, I presume, rightly or wrongly, that this is the Maiden of Heaven, the Holy Spirit, telling Baha'u'llah, tell the people this, tell them this. And it makes sense to me that that's what is occurring. And so some of the themes she exhorts him to say are to disclose the theme of abounding grace of God, the constancy that the manifestation must have in proclaiming the faith of God, regardless of what trials and tribulations he encounters. Talks about the mirrors. Now, the mirrors is a term used a lot in the poetry of Tahirih, but it's also used here in this work, and it represents, and it's also talked about in the Kitab-i-Igan, and it refers to those close followers who are, in effect, the mirrors of the qualities of the manifestations. They are, if you will, the first believers, the ones who will carry on the work of the faith. And then finally, she has lengthy homiletic matter. Now, homiletic means a homily is a sermon. And so there's some lengthy discourses here. One to the manifestations of my names, O concourse of divines and learned amongst men, and another to, and this is very important, to the people of the Bayan. Now, we've discussed this in many classes, but it's important to understand that the people of the Bayan are those who had recognized the Bab, but have not at this point recognized Baha'u'llah, and even some of them have sided with Mirza Yahya or Subi Azal, and have warred against Baha'u'llah. Not all of them, but when Baha'u'llah uses this term, it's after he's informed them that he is the promised one foretold by the Bab. And so it's almost always used in a disparaging tone. O people of the Bayan, why have you not recognized me, in effect? And of course, the trumpet call. Remember, there are two trumpet calls. The one, the appearance of the Bab, the unveiling of Tahirih at the conference of Badasht is one symbolic event that represents that trumpet call, that things have changed, that the day of days has come, the day of judgment, the quickening, as she calls it. And the second trumpet call, of course, is Baha'u'llah's declaration and these four instances that we've mentioned, but most particularly, of course, in the Garden of Rizwan, the most holy festival. Chapter 6, then, the letter. And so each of the following chapters deals with the 5 letters, though the letter to the Shah is the most lengthy, and indeed, if you take all of the other letters and put them together, they don't amount to the same length as the letter to the Shah. It is the most complete explanation of Baha'u'llah's mission. So he says very specifically, among other things, to the Pope that this is the second coming, and that why, you probably have read this many times, why are you in pomp and riches and castles instead of helping the poor in your midst? Let deeds be thy adorning. It's a very interesting, because he alludes to some of the things that the Pope has done. And the Pope's, this was the Pope, if you'll recall, who proclaimed that the papacy, or the papal decrees, are infallible. So until this point, the popes weren't infallible. Now they are. I forget whether that's retroactive or not. But rather interesting that he decides that the Pope is infallible, as at the same time he is being told that that Christ has returned, which means his rejection of that is an infallible disdain of the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ. Very ironic. There's all kinds of irony in here, in all of these letters, but particularly to the Pope. The letter to Napoleon III is the second letter. He had already sent one letter, which the ruler had cast behind his back. This is, whether he does this literally or not, this is a phrase Baha'u'llah uses when someone rejects something. You have cast behind your back the book of God, and so on. This means you've rejected it. So again, he talks about the return of Christ, because of course Napoleon is a Christian, at least nominally a Christian emperor. And he concludes with three themes: the obligations of a ruler to be just to his people. And Napoleon III did make a lot of improvements. And so you see in this that while the essential announcement falls on deaf ears, he understands his obligation to assist the people. The guidance for this day, and again, day means dispensation, to the people of France and to the people of the world. Excuse me. He concludes advice to the Pope, warning him that if he does not accede to Baha'u'llah's cautionary statements, that his empire will be taken from him, which it was about, I think, in 78, maybe earlier than that, I forget, but it wasn't long after that he lost the battle, and he spent his last days in England. The eighth chapter is on the letter to Tsar Alexander II. The Tsar, also, of course, a Christian ruler. This inescapable proof I'm talking about is in each of these letters, but particularly to Napoleon and to the Tsar, Baha'u'llah tells them things that only they know. In the case of one, it may be a prayer they were praying, and we answered your prayer. To Napoleon, it was, we heard the words you said about why you decided to get involved in the Crimean War, because you heard the people lamenting and so on. That's not the truth. That's not the real reason you got involved. You got involved to enlarge your own kingdom. So these proofs should have shaken these people to the core, you would think. I mean, again, if you can put yourself in their place, and it's hard to do, of course, they probably got all kinds of letters and petitions from all sorts of people. but to have one that told you something that only you knew about, or that only you and someone else knew about, who was not a prisoner in Akka, in a remote land, a prison city, that would be kind of strange, something you would certainly pay attention to. Chapter 9, the letter to Queen Victoria, very dramatic letter regarding governance, praises her for a couple of things: for abolishing slavery, praises her for putting the government in the hands of an advisory body, the parliament, which he praises the parliamentary form of government. And of course, we have a form of that today, where we elect representatives, and they elect the National Assembly, and then the National Assembly this very weekend, or these very days, it may have already happened, I don't know, and are in the Holy Land electing the House of Justice. And so there is the regard that Baha'u'llah has for this form of electing representatives who then advise the governmental authority above them until you have a final authority. He then suddenly just stops talking to her altogether and talks to the people of the world. Now, of course, her response to the letter was a quote from the Old Testament: "If it be of God, it will endure," which is not really saying I accept it, but it's saying I'm not saying it's not so. If it is so, it will endure. And of course, it has endured. So she doesn't reject that. And of course, it's no irony. Well, I guess it is ironic to a non-Baha'i, but not surprising. It is her, I believe, her niece, Queen Marie of Romania, who becomes a Baha'i after being taught by Martha Root. A very wonderful Baha'i at that. And her letters to Shoghi Effendi are just incredible, or wonderful. Well, to Abdul Baha, and I believe to Shoghi Effendi. I forget when she passed. Chapter 10 and chapter 11 are both on the letter to Nasir-ad-Din Shah. I divided into two chapters because it's incredibly lengthy. Now, if you'll remember, the history of the delivery of this letter and the effect it was to have, as well as the content, are all very memorable. This is the letter that Baha'u'llah said, whoever conveys this letter to the Shah will lose his life, because the Shah will no doubt be so incensed. Because remember, he thought he had already killed Baha'u'llah several times, or at least had collaborated in having him banished to the prison city of Akka, as well as being banished in the first place to Constantinople and then to Adrianople and so on. So the idea that this person whom he thought he had gotten rid of finally, or if not gotten rid of, whose faith had been diminished or demolished, suddenly here's this lengthy letter saying, I'm not dead, I'm very much alive, as is this faith. And not only that, but it's a kindly letter. You know, that would be almost worse than if Baha'u'llah had berated him or something. But no, it's very, he's an obedient citizen. He is a kind and loving advisor to the king. Tells him what he should do and what he shouldn't do. But the tone of it is very unexpected. And of course, Badi is the one who volunteers to take the letter, knowing he will be killed. And indeed, he is cruelly crushed to death, and is, to this day, we have pictures of him in his, both before he left and in his chains immediately prior to being killed. So this letter is no doubt the appropriate letter to end on. It is the most lengthy, and it contains, of course, this very important passage where Baha'u'llah almost seems to deny his station, that is, the loftiness of it. And he's doing this in this sense. He's saying to the Shah, I am, in effect, I am an intermediary. It is God talking through me to you. I was but a man like others, asleep upon my couch, when lo, the breezes of the Almighty wafted over me and taught me all that there is, all the knowledge there is, and so on. Now, this can be misunderstood, and fortunately for us, as I've noted in other classes, Abdu'l-Baha gives an authoritative explication and interpretation of this statement in some answered questions. And he says he doesn't mean that he literally was like other men. He means that I was asleep like anyone else might be upon my couch. And he's, of course, there's no couch. He's in the Siyachal. He's not on a couch. So he's like others asleep upon a couch is the idea. But Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha goes on to explain that what he means by this is, I was asleep, I was hidden, I was veiled, and now I am awake, and therefore I am manifesting myself and revealing my cause. It's a very interesting explanation, interpretation, authoritative interpretation of this passage. But nevertheless, to the Shah, it would sound like that he's being very humble, that he is merely being the conveyor of the message in the same fashion, if you will, that Baha'i was. So even as that young man brought you this message, I too am bringing this message. He brought it from me, and I am bringing it from God. So he goes on to tell the king what the pen of the Most High has inspired Baha'u'llah to tell him. And I say it has a symphonic structure in this epistle. In fact, the whole work of the Súrih Hekel is very symphonic. And by that I mean there are various themes that permeate the work, that go through it, that are repeated, and so on. And the main one, of course, is that God appears to us as clearly as we are able to understand it through the temple of the manifestation, and that the manifestation confers authority upon the governmental structures that govern our lives, and then ultimately you have the authority bestowed upon us individually. So we have our duty as well. So there are several prayers. It's a very complex work. The delegation of authority I just mentioned, the theme of justice, judge us fairly. You have under your sway, he goes on to say, all kinds of religions. Of course, he had Christianity, he had Islam, of course, the Iran, or Persia as it was then, was the stronghold of Shia Islam. And so he is a de facto head of Shia Islam. So he's got all of these religions under his guidance. And he says, so why treat us any differently? So justice is a major theme, particularly in judging the Baha'is in Iran. The theme of a new revelation from God. And he talks about parallels to the treatment of the fourth Imam. What he's talking about is that one of the most highly revered Imams in Shia Islam is the Imam Hussein. In fact, Baha'u'llah, of course, is named after him, Mirza Hussein Ali, both Hussein and the first Imam Ali. And the Imam Hussein was killed outside Baghdad and on the plains of Karbala, and his throat was cut, and he was very ignominiously and horribly treated. And he says, this you're in the same situation here, that you're going against your own your own successor to the religion that you claim to be a part of. So you have the theme of the purity of his motive, the value of suffering, and the urgency of the moment. The urgency of the moment being again this idea of seize the lesser piece while you can, while it is available to you. And again cautions him that if you reject these words, you will lose your kingdom. And indeed, the Nasir-ad-Din Shah was assassinated. And not too long thereafter, you had the abolition of the Tsar dynasty itself and the emergence of a constitutional government. Finally, the contemporary relevance of the Súrih Hekel, and I've no need to go into this in detail, but the idea of the body of God coming to us in the form of a manifestation, the delegation of authority, the path to the lesser peace, and the birth of a new vision, which I refer to, in which I refer to the plans, the teaching plans that are now before us as a result of this new vision. So all of this is summing up the contemporary relevance of this work, so that you don't see it merely as an interesting historical document, even though it is also that, but you don't see it solely as an interesting moment in religious history, but that it is speaking to us here and now and exhorting us with the same cautionary statements that Baha'u'llah shares with each of these five rulers. And one of the important things about this, by the way, is that the work ends with a paragraph with the maiden speaking once again, to show that that these letters weren't just sort of tacked on, that these were made integral to the work as a whole. So he really reshaped the entire work, not only to accommodate these letters, but to make it more relevant. And this, as I've said before, was one of the first works that Baha'u'llah had ordered to be published during his own lifetime, which it was. And as I've also mentioned before, many of the people throughout the Middle East and India, for example, where it was published, waited to see when the specific prophecies of Baha'u'llah with which he cautioned these rulers would come true. And sure enough, every one of them did. And to understand the totality of that, the fruition of those, you should read The Promised Day Has Come, where Shoghi Effendi discusses in great detail the fall of the papacy, effectively, the fall of the Qajar dynasty, and how each of the rulers to whom he wrote suffered the consequences of their rejection, and the specifics. For example, the letter to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, where Baha'u'llah says that the Rhine will run twice with gore. Those aren't his words. He says it is run with gore, and it will have another time. So he predicts very clearly the First and Second World Wars, in which Germany was decimated. So I talk here about the value of outlining the work, but I've already discussed that. but don't need to go over those. So that is the end of the slides for this evening. Thank you very much. And we will now begin the Q&A.